Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader,
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
and we're the insiders. So, Scott, the big race in Wisconsin, the biggest race, is the Supreme Court race. And it has a remarkable cast of characters beyond the actual candidates, including Elon Musk and others. It is lately, these races have gone toward the Democrats or the progressives. And I think we can safely say that that's it. But who knows? I mean, there's a lot going on in this race, and again, a record amount of money being spent. What's your take on where we're headed, who's involved, and what's your prediction on the result?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, 2 years or last time we had one of these races, we thought $50 million being spent on it was nuts. Couldn't be, it was the biggest in American history by a factor of three. And here we are, the media is reporting we're already over $100 million in this race for Supreme Court. And of course, that begs the question, like, why are people spending so much money on this race? And why would two of the richest people in the world, George Soros and Elon Musk, be investing in a nonpartisan race in Wisconsin? And I think the answer there is simply that Wisconsin is the state that essentially decides who the next president will be, the state who decides who's the majority in the United States Senate, the state that decides who controls Congress. It's all about power. And Wisconsin is the state that is right at the edge and often the one that makes those decisions. Plus, a Supreme Court can, despite its being a nonpartisan race, can clearly enact an ideological agenda. And in this case, the majority is up for grabs, whether it will be a liberal majority on the court or a conservative majority on the court. So that attracts people from around the country who care about the ideology of a swing state and which agenda is advancing in that swing state, whether it's a conservative agenda or a liberal agenda. The one thing we know from normally in a spring election is that the turnout is rather small. Even in a hot year, it might be 25 to 30%. But you start spending $100 million, and I've now had, and I haven't been home this last week, but we've had three people come to our door already to make sure that my wife and I are voting in the race for Supreme Court. That is almost as much as we saw during the presidential election. So a great deal of money is being spent on turnout in this race. And as you know, when more money gets spent and the campaigns get nastier and more negative, it actually increases the turnout rather than decreases it. So I think we're going to see a bigger than expected turnout. The race is a dead heat at the moment, and I think it's going to be really, really close on election night.
Well, I think a lot of Scott's analysis there is correct. I have been thinking that the race would be a bigger swing toward the progressive, in this case, Susan Crawford, because that's been the recent history in these races. Janet Protasewicz, who is the progressive candidate, won with an 11-point margin. That's unusual. But the reason for that is that the spring electorate, as Scott points out, is generally much smaller. Presidential, we're around 70%. Gubernatorial, we're around 50%. And as Scott points out, we're 25 or 30% when it comes to Supreme Court races. But there is an enormous amount of money being spent. And I know that Musk himself, both in the general election for Trump and in this race, are spending an enormous amount of money on trying to up the turnout. So if you see increased turnout, that's a reflection that his strategy worked. And frankly, it is a matter of getting your people to the polls. This is an ultimate turnout election. But then why are they here? Why is Elon Musk here? Well, a lot of it is he's just continuing to buy favor with Trump, but also he actually has a case for Tesla that's going through the Wisconsin court system, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court will decide that. And he's a bright guy, so he knows, and it's true, that there isn't a single case that's had a partisan tint to it that Brad Schimel hasn't done exactly, whether he's as a DA or attorney general or a judge, that he hasn't done exactly what the conservative side wanted. So that's a pretty good bet on Elon's part if he can get Brad Schimel in there. And that's really not a good thing for the judiciary, for democracy, or whatever. But there it is. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, and he seems to be spending, it's at least $12 million, but I would not be surprised if it'll be more. And, you know, the Republicans have talked for 30 years about George Soros, but there are billionaires all over the map for Trump. And you saw half of them standing by him at his inauguration or behind him. And I really think that people at some point are going to tire of this. I think the billionaires, that picture is going to be iconic 10 or 20 years from now, because I think it is actually going to turn people against them. Once people finally figure out that they are the ones who are not paying their fair taxes, they are the ones who are resulting in you and many others in your family having to go through bankruptcy because of medical debt and other things because we don't have a fair system like other countries have. At some point, this is going to turn. And Donald Trump is only going to be around for one more term. Who's going to get the blame after that? And I think there's a good chance it's going to go onto the billionaires, the oligarchy. And I think this election really, at the end of the day, it's about oligarchy versus, you know, the average voter. And I don't know that that's the way. It's certainly not being played that way, in spite of the fact that there's $100 million being spent. But what is the race going to come down to? Okay. The problem is he who defines the message oftentimes the issue that you're going to deliver a message on determines the result. I think although Susan Crawford and her allies have really pointed out that abortion is a huge thing, if you want abortion to be legal, you better be voting for Susan Crawford. Otherwise, Brad Schimel has made it clear that he is going to say abortion's not legal in Wisconsin based on the 1849 law, and good luck getting the legislature to change it. Problem is they haven't defined that as the issue in the race. Right. Instead, there's been an awful lot of more ads being done on the issue of crime. Now, both Schimel and Crawford have big problems when it comes to this issue because they're sentencing things, or in Schimel's case, he gets a contribution from a guy's lawyer, then he gives him a really light sentence. You know, that doesn't mean that it directly connects to the thing, but it sure as heck looks bad. So you'd think, well, they're fighting to a draw. But here's the problem with that, as Scott would point out. Number one, people tend to agree with the guy versus the woman on this. Hate shouldn't be, but they're going to be tougher on crime. Number two, they identify more with conservatives than liberals when it comes to tough on crime. And finally, they will also go with, okay, who has law enforcement endorsements? And by the way, I think Susan Crawford has the best law enforcement endorsement I can think of in the state, and that's Sheriff Dave Mahoney, former sheriff in Dane County, who's an amazing guy and does a remarkable job when it comes to law enforcement. But he has more in terms of numbers. We got a lot more conservative counties in this state that are voting Republican. But again, even the endorsements of the sheriffs and the others all comes down to partisanship. And that's a really sad thing. We supposedly have three separate branches of government, and a judiciary is supposed to be the one that's independent. Years ago, you would have justices run without even any opposition. Yeah. That's how nonpartisan it was. That has changed. And I'm not excited about the fact that it's so partisan, but that's where we're at. And I'm afraid that it's going to be a close race. And if Elon Musk is effective on getting that turnout up, you know, we just had an election not long ago and Trump was able to win. So I'm optimistic about the progressive, but I am very nervous. And I think the polling shows, one poll that was out there showed that it's a dead heat. There have been a lot of different things that I've heard about internal polls. So I'm optimistic, but meaning, of course, that I support the progressive here and think that Susan Crawford is going to win. But I am definitely one nervous Nelly. And there are probably tens of millions of dollars to ads that are going to come out before the election that are going to potentially change the results here.
Well, I think you're right that this is a question of which issue is going to dominate here, whether it is crime, law enforcement's choice, or the issue of abortion. And 25 and 30 years ago when I was running these races, both the candidates from the left and the candidates from the right raced to get law enforcement endorsements because that was the way to win. Shirley Abrahamson spent years collecting the endorsements of sheriffs and police chiefs all around the state. So when Republicans would say, oh, she's a liberal, she'd say, that can't be true. I've got all these law enforcement people standing behind me. I'm tough on crime. That was the winning strategy for a long, long time. And then you saw the last election where clearly abortion made a big difference in that election. Now, I think the polling has suggested that that issue is not as potent, not as strong today as it was 4 years ago, 2 years ago, even a year ago. So I think all that gets us to sort of a traditional Wisconsin answer where this is going to be extraordinarily close. I am hopeful because I've known Brad Schimel for like 25 years that he's the winner, and I think he is the more qualified candidate for the job. But I can't say for sure who's going to win this race. It's just going to be extraordinarily close, as Wisconsin almost always
One
is.
other thing we should probably talk about though, Scott, too. I think we agree a lot on these things. One of the things that will happen with this race, if Schimel is elected, Schimel will be taking away the right to vote for many people. He will be making it more difficult for marginal people to vote. Absolutely. That's the Republican game plan. Fewer people voting is better. Now, that isn't so much the case anymore, but he will do that. And it will try what it tries to do. Republicans, even going to Scott Walker, he made sure that the Department of Motor Vehicle location in the west side of Madison, which was changed, was placed at least a half mile away from the closest bus stop. So that when you have to go and get your license updated so that you can vote in the election because you have the wrong address and blah 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 blah, you have to not only take a bus if you don't have a car, but you also have to walk a half a mile. And that was consciously done. It's a conscious strategy of Republicans to do it. And Brad Schimel will make it harder for you to exercise your right to vote. Oh, by the way, there's also a vote on taking away your right to vote with requiring photo ID and putting it into the Wisconsin state constitution. It's it's loved by everybody. Everybody said, well, of course we want to have people to ID. You know what? It's a solution in search of a problem. So this Supreme Court race could make your right to vote less available, lots of other things less available. It will help Elon Musk in whatever other private endeavors that he has. But at the end of the day, my bottom line for you folks, if you care about whether or not abortion will be legal, if you care about your right to vote, if you care about any one of a dozen different items, if you're the average guy and not Elon Musk, if you're not an oligarch, look for Susan Crawford on the ballot.
That commercial is brought to you by Crawford for Supreme Court. Now, listen, Chuck, on the same ballot as the Supreme Court race, we're going to have a voter ID challenge, a voter ID constitutional amendment, excuse me. Susan Crawford tried to challenge that law. Brad Schimel was supportive of that law. The people of Wisconsin will be overwhelmingly in favor of the voter ID constitutional amendment. They don't think that's taken away somebody's right to vote. That they think that is ensuring the integrity of the vote in
Thousands,
Wisconsin.
thousands of people will not be able to vote because of that. And there is no problem with people going in because there's a felony if you go and vote in a couple of places. And by the way, of the few people who have been convicted of that, many of them are Republicans. But it is not, it is a solution in search of a problem. There is no problem. But Republicans will use the public perception that this is the right thing to do, and it is not. And I predict that it will win in a landslide, and it will be in the Wisconsin Constitution, which is an outrage. Any constitutional scholar would say nothing like this should ever make it in a state or federal constitution. But there you go. Fun, fun, fun on election.